So this week we're talking about standards, essential questions, and learning targets. Ideally, this is review from 5010. I don't want to belabor any of it, but a lot of this is important to being able to write standards-based IEP goals. So we're going to start just with standards and learning targets. Again, I'm pretty confident that this is review for you. So whenever you're planning anything, you know that you have to unpack the standards, right? You cannot plan anything right from the standard itself because it's kind of jam-packed full of a lot of different skills and a lot of different content in just one standard. So that process of unpacking, which I know is not new to you, you go through and you identify the nouns and the verbs. All of the nouns, key nouns, I would say, that's the content of the standards, and then all the key verbs are the skills of the standard. Sounds familiar, right? So it's really important to consider the context of the standard, that meaning, are there prerequisite skills that if a student does not have them, they won't be able to meet that standard? You have to think through those things, and that's why unpacking is so helpful. So just an example, this should look very familiar. This is, if we were going to unpack this standard, it is 4th grade reading standard 2. The standard is determine a theme or central idea of text and explain how it's supported by key details, and then summarize the text. So if I were going to go through and analyze the nouns or the content, I see theme, central idea, key details, and summary, right? The verbs that I see, those are the skills. I see determine, explain, support, and summarize. Now, when I think about overall context or additional context, determining importance is so important because students have to they have to find key details. Well, what makes a key is the importance, right? Sequencing absolutely comes into play because of those key details, but also to be able to appropriately summarize. And then relevant details, which kind of goes back to the determining importance. What's relevant versus irrelevant? Okay? I don't know. Maybe there are others that you can think of to add to this list, but that's kind of the process. The content, the skills, and then additional context. So like I said, that should look familiar. Okay, so moving on to essential questions. Again, I know this should be review. There is this section in the unit plan template that says enduring understandings or essential questions. I'll be frank, I don't use enduring understandings because I don't find them useful for students. Students, you can ask the essential question. I like to have it posted throughout a whole unit, so that way students are looking at it the whole time. But, so ultimately what essential questions are, I always say it's got to be something that you cannot answer at the end of one lesson. It's only something that can be answered after a bunch of learning has occurred. So they have to be written as open-ended. They have to be thought-provoking. That's kind of the whole point. If you're going to study it over a whole unit, it probably should be thought-provoking. It has to be higher order thinking. If it's a low-level question, that's not really essential, and it's really going to be able to be answered quickly. The ideas that will come from that question have to be important and transferable to other areas. They can be questions that raise additional questions, which kind of leads to inquiry, and also aligns with research as well. They have to be the kinds of questions that require support and justification. So again, if all that learning is happening throughout the unit, students will have that by the end to be able to answer that big question. And they're the kinds of questions that recur over time. So you could write an essential question and use the exact same essential question in another unit if it's applicable. I hope that makes sense. So again, I know it's more review. So when you are writing a unit, you unpack the unit standards in the same way you would unpack for a lesson. There are just more of them. But you have to think about what questions do they answer. If you could group some of those, the bulleted items or some of the competencies that you pull out of a standard, what questions would they lead towards? It's important to think about something more overarching, so it's not super targeted, super focused, but it's bigger picture. it's important really to think about the context, not beginning words of the question. A lot of times teachers will get stuck on the verb that they use in the question, thinking that that's what's going to help them make it higher level. That's a very Bloom's taxonomy way of thinking, but it's not those first few words, it's the context of the question. And then I think people may or may not disagree. It's important to keep it to a manageable number in a unit. To be honest, I write one essential question per unit, maybe two. But honestly, if I'm studying something and I've written that question in a way that really is all encompassing and very inquiry based, one question should drive the learning for the entire unit. That's just me. So, again, probably more review, so please just humor me. But research does show that teachers tend to ask lower level questions. And that's just in general. And I think it's because it's easy. It's quick. We know students are reading or following along if we ask them a low level question, right? But that's not all that helpful when it comes to essential questions. If you ask low level questions, you'll get overwhelmed because there would just be too much content for you to try to cover. So I like this quote: a constant return to those questions makes it far more likely that students who struggle with the content or have fallen behind will have multiple points of contact and re-entry with the subject matter. So if you think about what that's saying, essential questions absolutely support differentiation. We know that students all have different access points to content, depending on their background knowledge, depending on their literacy skills, for, whatever reasons. So multiple entry points really is how we should always be preparing instruction anyway, but essential questions help us do that. So if we post them, not just in our lesson plan or our unit plan, but post them in the classroom and refer to them throughout the unit regularly, not like once in a while, that again gives those multiple access points for students. Okay? So, when we're creating essential questions, it's really helpful to utilize pre-assessments. Well, this really goes for anything, but utilizing pre-assessments to identify students' current understandings and then misconceptions, right? We should start every single lesson that way. We should start every unit that way as well. So once we've done that, we might want to adjust the essential question we had written for our unit, depending on what current understanding students have. Our essential questions should really focus on transfer. So whatever they learn in this unit transfers to outside learning, right? That kind of answers the question like, why am I learning this? You have to relate it to real life or some other area that's important to students. They should also sustain inquiry. So again, it should sustain that idea of asking questions, seeking answers, asking more questions throughout the entire unit, and then really foster rich discussion. One point to mention, and I don't know where everyone is or where you've been working, but especially at the secondary level, textbooks. A lot of teachers see textbooks as the curriculum. Textbooks are a resource, not the curriculum, right? You aren't handed a textbook and expected to teach that whole thing from cover to cover. You have curriculum materials that you need to cover. So it's important to just remember that the textbooks are just the resource. And then this last quote by McTeague and Wiggins: effective use of essential questions inevitably leads to an increase in the number of student questions. Think about how rich that is in the classroom. If you can pose one question that gets students engaged and it gets them learning and seeking answers and then asking more questions, that's really what we want happening in our classrooms all the time. So I've said this a few times now, but essential questions should really foster an inquiry approach to your lessons and your classroom. The whole idea of inquiry is you're constantly seeking more information about something you're inquiring about. So you have to have an interest in it. You have to be motivated, but it's this constant seeking of information. So an essential question by its nature leads to further questions. And that's the brilliance of just starting. That's like why I said I only have one. If it's written well enough, students are going to come up with their own questions, or even as a class, you might come up with further questions that you want to seek answers toward throughout a unit.